Welcome to another short guide video. Today we're looking at shock troops. So these are referred to several times in both the Ancients and Medieval Manual. Come broadly in two categories, foot and mounted. So infantry shock troops are either impact foot, offensive spearmen, pikemen who still have enough men remaining to qualify for the deep pike POA, or any unit that is determined foot, which in reality is basically just the Swiss. So the main difference in behavior is that shock infantry, who charge other infantry, have a chance to push back the enemy. So the enemy cannot fall back from them losing a combat, they just get pushed back and the melee continues. So for one thing, pushing back the enemy can lead you to getting flanked, which is bad, but it can also help you, say, kill archers, right, without them falling back and getting protected by another unit or shooting you again. That's pretty straightforward. What can be interesting is if you are, say, using spearmen against impact foot. So who pushes back is based on who was the original attacker in the combat. So if you have impact foot, then you kind of want to be the one doing the charging because impact is really good. If the enemy holds firm, the melee odds aren't great, but since you're the attacker, if you lose, then you'll fall back. And if you were lucky enough to hold firm, then you've got another juicy impact smash ready to go. So if you have spearmen against impact foot, even though the impact is terrible, it can at times make sense to attack because if you tank the impact, or if you block them in with a light unit behind them or something, the melee odds are better because impact foot are always swordsmen, which is halved against steady spearmen. So in that case, if you land the impact, then every subsequent melee you have pretty good odds, and the impact foot can't fall back and charge again. They just get pushed back, and the melee continues. How this works with multiple units can get pretty confusing, especially because the game does not in any way in the UI indicate to you which unit was the original attacker. But for example, you have these raw legionaries, they'll charge these crossbowmen, right? So they are now the attacker. If you now have these Praetorian Guard, if they charge these raw legionaries, the Guard are not a separate attacker. So this is all going to be considered one melee. So even though we have shock foot charging an enemy, they don't get flagged as the attacker because they're charging an enemy who already initiated a combat and are flagged attacker. So we'll get in. Well, okay, they're raw. But that was a case where they had a chance to fall back instead of being pushed back by the Guard. So you just have to sort of remember who is who. Pikemen are a bit different. They will push the enemy back, but only if they have enough men left to qualify for any amount of deep pike. So for your standard size pike unit, that's if they've taken 25% losses, they are no longer shock foot. Note that it doesn't matter that they don't get the deep pike POA if disordered for the purposes of deciding if they are still shock foot. So even though when disordered like this they don't get any deep pike POA, they still have enough men to get it, so they're still flagged as shock foot. And the Swiss determined foot are a little bit different. So the heavy weapon is not normally a shock foot category, but these guys, because they are determined foot, are shock foot. Then with the Swiss pikemen, the Kyle or non-Kyle versions, doesn't matter, they're determined foot. So even if they lose enough men to lose the deep pike POA, they are still shock foot because they're still determined foot. That troop type is what determines that status. Then mounted shock troops. These consist of lancers, knightly lancers, and heavy chariots. So there's some similarities. So mounted shock troops that charge any enemy cavalry, basically. They stick in, so if the enemy cavalry loses a combat against them, that enemy cavalry cannot fall back. So in this case, if you have a unit of light spear cavalry, if these lancers charge them, they couldn't fall back after losing in combat. If they charge the lancers, they could fall back after losing in combat. And so, for that matter, could the lancers, because these guys are not shock cavalry. Notably, elephants are not shock cavalry. So this can matter because elephants are really good at murdering cavalry, and lancers, such as cataphracts, can't evade. But in this case, the elephants can charge the cataphracts. If the cataphracts lose the combat, they can in fact fall back out of that combat because these don't count as shock troops. The main feature of shock troops, mounted shock troops, is that they strip charging infantry of their POAs. Alright, so what do I mean? Offensive spearmen, impact, 100 versus any troops, unless they're charging mounted shock troops. So here, if we charge, we get no impact capabilities. The mounted shock troops get everything. What about in non-open terrain? So Lancers is a POA that is dependent on open terrain. Well, you get no impact capabilities, they get no impact capabilities, they do get their quality. So mounted shock troops can be used pretty effectively to pin down or at least delay larger numbers of infantry units. So, as usual, pretty short guide. The main thing is to try to remember who initiated a combat and how that matters even in a multi-unit melee. Unfortunately, the game does not visually track this for us at all. So you just have to pay attention and remember what's going on. Good times.